In the summer of 1831, the county of Southampton in southeastern Virginia held within its borders approximately 9,000 white residents and nearly 7,000 enslaved persons. The land stretched flat and humid, broken by stands of pine and fields of cotton that required constant labor under a sun that offered no mercy. The houses of the masters stood elevated on small rises when such geography allowed, while the quarters that housed the enslaved sat lower, constructed of rough timber with gaps that admitted winter cold and summer heat alike. Nathaniel Turner lived on the property of Joseph Travis, a man who worked as a wheelwright and had come into possession of Turner through marriage to a widow. Turner was then 30 years of age, small in stature, with a manner that others found unsettling. He did not speak often in the presence of white persons, but among those who shared his condition, he was known to speak at length about visions and signs that he claimed to have witnessed since childhood. Some called him a preacher, others used the word prophet. The masters knew him as a slave who could read, an unusual and troubling circumstance that had resulted from the lenience of a previous owner. The daily routine began before first light. The enslaved rose from thin pallets and moved into the fields or to their assigned tasks. Within the house or workshop, they worked through the heat of midday with brief pauses for cornmeal and whatever else might be provided. The overseers carried whips of braided leather. These were used with varying frequency depending on the temperament of the man who held them. In Southampton County, the treatment was said to be less severe than in the deeper South, but this was a relative measure that held little comfort. Turner had been taught to read by the son of his first master, Benjamin Turner, who had owned his mother. This education set him apart and created expectations that proved difficult to manage. He had attempted escape once, at the age of 21, and had returned after 30 days in the woods. His reasons for returning were never made entirely clear. Some said he had received a vision instructing him to go back. Others believed he had simply found the world beyond the plantation too hostile for a man marked as property D. In the years that followed, Turner worked in the fields and spoke of signs in the sky. He described a vision in which he had seen white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle. He spoke of blood on the corn and of hieroglyphics on leaves. Many dismissed these utterances as the products of an unsound mind. Others listened with an attention that suggested they heard in his words something that resonated with their own unspoken thoughts. The structure of daily life in Southampton County rested upon the assumption that the current arrangement would continue indefinitely. White families lived with the constant presence of enslaved persons who cooked their food, raised their children, and knew the interior of their homes with an intimacy that might have troubled them had they paused to consider it. Yet the system persisted through force and custom. The laws of Virginia made it illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write. They made it illegal for more than a small number to gather without white supervision. They prescribed death for any enslaved person who raised a hand against a white person, regardless of circumstance. Turner had married a woman named Cherry who lived on a neighboring property. They had children. The separation of families through sale or hire was common, and the fear of such separation hung over every relationship between enslaved persons. Turner himself had been sold or transferred multiple times in his life, each transaction severing connections and establishing new ones under conditions he could not control. The summer heat bore down without relief. In the fields, men and women moved along the rows with implements that raised blisters even on hands long accustomed to labor. Children too young for field work carried water or minded infants. The elderly performed what tasks their bodies still allowed. At night, They returned to quarters where conversation was conducted in low tones, always with an awareness that words could be overheard and reported. Turner spent his evenings in a manner different from most. He sat alone, or with a small number of trusted individuals, and spoke of things he had read in the Bible. He focused on passages from the Old Testament, accounts of the Israelites in bondage, and their eventual deliverance. He spoke of Moses and of the plagues visited upon Egypt. His listeners understood that he was not merely recounting stories but drawing comparisons that did not need to be stated explicitly. The white population of Southampton County went about their affairs with minimal concern for uprising. There had been no significant slave revolt in Virginia since the early days of the century. The conspiracy led by Gabriel Prosser in 1800 had ended in executions. Denmark Vesey's planned revolt in South Carolina in 1822 had been betrayed before it could begin. These events were known, but they were considered aberrations, the work of exceptional circumstances that did not apply to the present day. In the Travis household, the daily routine proceeded as it had for months and years prior. Joseph Travis rose early to his work at the forge and wheel. His wife managed the house with the assistance of the enslaved. There was no indication that anything had shifted, no warning that the pattern was about to break. The system under which Turner and thousands like him lived was not one that required dramatic cruelty to maintain its essential injustice. The foundation was ownership itself, the legal designation of human beings as property to be bought, sold, and disposed of at the will of another. This arrangement was enforced by law, custom, and the implicit threat of violence that stood behind every command given by a white person to an enslaved one. Turner had been owned by 5 different white families by the time he reached the age of 30. Each transfer occurred without his consent and without regard for the connections he had formed. His mother had been sold away from him when he was young. His father had escaped and never been recovered. These separations were not acts of personal malice but the ordinary functioning of the system. A master died and the estate was settled. Debts came due and assets were liquidated. A widow remarried and properties were consolidated. In each instance, human lives were rearranged to serve the economic interests of white families. The particular injustice that Turner focused upon was not his own suffering alone, but the comprehensive denial of humanity that the system represented. He had learned to read and had applied this skill to the Bible, finding there accounts of bondage and liberation that seemed to speak directly to his condition. He began to tell others that he had been shown signs, that he had been marked for a special purpose. Some dismissed this as delusion. Others began to watch him more carefully. In February of 1831, Turner witnessed an eclipse of the sun. He interpreted this as the sign he had been waiting for, an indication that the time was approaching when he should act. He confided in 4 men whom he trusted: Henry Porter, Hart Travis, Nelson Williams, and Samuel Francis. These men were enslaved on nearby properties and had known Turner for years. He told them that they would strike a blow against their enslavers, that they would kill those who held them in bondage and fight their way to freedom, or die in the attempt. The plan was not elaborate. There was no coordination with enslaved persons in other counties, no appeal to outside forces for assistance. Turner believed that once they began, others would join them, that the act itself would spark a general uprising across Southampton County and perhaps beyond. He set a date in July but then postponed the action, claiming that he required another sign. The men Turner had recruited waited. They continued their daily labor, showing no outward indication of what they intended. This was necessary because the consequences of discovery would be immediate and fatal. The laws of Virginia prescribed death for any enslaved person who conspired to rebel. The method of execution was hanging, often carried out publicly as a warning to others. Those who knew of a conspiracy and failed to report it faced the same penalty. Throughout the spring and summer, Turner continued to preach and to speak of visions. He described seeing drops of blood on the corn in the fields. He told of finding figures and numbers drawn on leaves, hieroglyphics that he interpreted as messages from God. Whether these visions were genuine products of his mind or rhetorical devices meant to inspire others cannot be determined from the historical record. What is clear is that they served to reinforce his authority among those who followed him. The white population remained largely unaware of Turner's activities. He was known as a preacher among the enslaved, but this was not unusual. Religious gatherings, when permitted, were seen as a means of social control, a way to encourage submission and obedience through Christian teaching. The passages that Turner emphasized, however, were not those that counseled patience and acceptance, but those that spoke of deliverance through violent intervention. In August, Turner witnessed another atmospheric phenomenon, a bluish-green color in the sun that he took as the final sign. He informed his small group of followers that they would act on the night of August 21st, a Sunday. They would begin at the Travis farm, killing the family there while they slept. They would then move from house to house, gathering weapons and additional men, killing every white person they encountered until they had amassed sufficient force to march on the county seat of Jerusalem, where they would seize the armory and make their stand. The injustice that drove Turner to this plan was not a matter of personal grievance against Joseph Travis, who was said to be a relatively lenient master. It was the system itself, the totality of a social order built on the presumption that one race of people had the right to own another. Turner had concluded that this system would not end through persuasion or gradual reform. It would end only through blood. On the evening of August 21st, Turner and his initial group of followers gathered in the woods near the Travis farm. They consumed brandy taken from a nearby still. Turner had told them that no one should be spared, that mercy would only lead to their own destruction. The white inhabitants of Southampton County went to sleep that night, with no knowledge that anything was about to change. They trusted in the laws and customs that had preserved their position for generations. That trust was about to be shattered in a manner that would send waves of terror across the entire South. The hours before midnight on August 21st passed in silence at the Travis farm. The household slept. Joseph Travis and his wife Sally lay in their bed. 3 children slept in nearby rooms. An apprentice wheelwright named Putnam Moore occupied a small space in the workshop. They had no reason to believe that this night would be different from any other. In the woods a short distance away, Turner and 6 men prepared themselves. The initial group had grown by one. Jack Reese had joined them that evening. They had discussed the plan in low voices, passing a bottle between them to steady their nerves. Turner reminded them that there could be no hesitation, that if they allowed even one person to escape, the alarm would be raised and they would all be hunted down and killed. At approximately 2 hours past midnight, they moved toward the house. Turner climbed through a window and opened the door from inside to admit the others. They carried axes and hatchets. They had deliberately chosen not to use firearms because the sound of gunshots would carry across the flat landscape and alert other households. The killing had to be done quietly. They entered the bedroom where Joseph Travis and his wife lay sleeping. Turner struck the first blow with a hatchet, hitting Travis in the head. The blow did not kill him immediately. Travis cried out. Another man, Will Francis, took the hatchet and struck repeatedly until Travis lay dead. Sally Travis woke and attempted to rise. She was struck down in the same manner. The children were killed in their rooms. Putnam Moore was found and killed in the workshop. Within the space of perhaps 10 minutes, 5 people lay dead in the Travis house. The group took what weapons they could find, several muskets, powder, and shot. They also took Joseph Travis's horse and a small amount of money. Then they moved to the next farm, belonging to Salathiel Francis, where they killed him and a young nephew. They continued to the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Reese, a widow who owned several enslaved persons. They killed her and her son. At each house, enslaved persons were given the choice to join them. Some did. Others fled or hid. By dawn on Monday, August 22nd, the group had grown to approximately 15 men. They moved with increased boldness as daylight came. They attacked the home of Mrs. Catherine Whitehead, a woman of advanced age who had been kind to some of the enslaved persons in the area. This kindness did not spare her. She was killed along with her son Richard, her daughter Margaret, and several grandchildren. The bodies were left where they fell. Throughout Monday, the killing continued. The group attacked isolated farmhouses, striking quickly and moving on before alarm could spread. They killed men, women, and children without distinction. The methods were brutal by necessity. Hatchets and axes were used to conserve ammunition. The enslaved persons who joined the group brought with them knowledge of which households had weapons and which had valuables that could be seized. By Monday afternoon, word had begun to spread that something terrible was happening in Southampton County. A few white residents had managed to escape the attacks and reach Jerusalem, the county seat. They brought reports of enslaved persons moving in an armed group, killing every white person they encountered. The reports were initially met with disbelief. The idea that enslaved persons would rise up in coordinated violence seemed impossible to many whites who had convinced themselves that their enslaved workers were content or at least resigned to their condition. The alarm spread quickly once it was confirmed. Riders were sent to neighboring counties and to the state militia posts. Church bells were rung to call white men to arms. Families that lived in isolated areas abandoned their homes and fled toward Jerusalem or other places where they might find protection. The roads filled with refugees carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Some families left behind enslaved persons who had served them for years, suddenly unsure of whom they could trust. Turner's group reached its maximum size of approximately 60 men on Monday evening. They had killed somewhere near 50 white persons by this time. Turner's plan had been to march on Jerusalem and seize the armory there, but he hesitated. Some accounts suggest he stopped to rest his men. Others indicate he delayed to allow more enslaved persons to join them. Whatever the reason, this delay proved fatal to the uprising's chances of success. The white militia began to organize on Monday night. Men arrived from neighboring counties. Farmers and merchants took up whatever weapons they possessed. By Tuesday morning, organized resistance had formed. The first engagement occurred near a farm owned by James Parker. Turner's group approached and was met with gunfire from armed white men who had fortified the house. Several of Turner's followers were killed or wounded. The group retreated in confusion. This was the turning point. The momentum that had carried them through 2 days of unchallenged attacks was broken. White reinforcements continued to arrive. Troops from Fort Monroe were dispatched. Militia companies from North Carolina crossed the border. The enslaved persons who had joined Turner's group began to scatter. Some fled into the swamps and woods. Others attempted to return to their home plantations, hoping they would not be identified as participants. By Tuesday afternoon, the uprising had effectively ended as an organized force. Turner and a small number of followers remained at large. But they were now fugitives, rather than an attacking force. The white population, having recovered from its initial shock, turned to revenge. Enslaved persons throughout Southampton County and the surrounding region were arrested on the slightest suspicion. Some were questioned. Others were killed on the spot by vigilante groups that roamed the countryside. The bodies of enslaved persons, both those who had participated in the uprising and those who had not, were left hanging from trees as warnings. The violence that followed the suppression of Turner's uprising exceeded in scope and indiscriminate cruelty anything that had come before. The white population of Southampton County and the surrounding areas, having been seized by terror, responded with a campaign of retribution that made no careful distinction between the guilty and the innocent. Militia companies and volunteer groups moved through the county searching for participants in the uprising. When enslaved persons were found, they were often killed immediately without any attempt to determine their actual involvement. Bodies were decapitated and the heads placed on posts along roads as warnings. Some were killed in ways deliberately designed to be slow and painful. The exact number of enslaved persons killed in this manner will never be known, but contemporary accounts suggest it was well over 100, perhaps double that figure. The legal proceedings that followed were only marginally more restrained. Virginia law required that enslaved persons accused of crimes be given trials, but these were summary affairs conducted by panels of justices rather than juries. The accused had no right to legal representation in any meaningful sense. The trials were conducted quickly, often with multiple defendants heard in a single day. Evidence was minimal. Testimony from other enslaved persons was obtained through coercion and threat. 48 enslaved persons were brought to trial in Southampton County in the weeks following the uprising. 30 were convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. 18 were found not guilty or had their cases dismissed. Several others were transported out of Virginia and sold, a punishment considered merciful by comparison to execution. The trials took place in an atmosphere of vengeance and fear. White residents packed the courthouse. Outside, armed men stood guard against the possibility of further violence. Among those tried and executed were the men who had been closest to Turner in the planning and execution of the uprising. Hark Travis was hanged. Nelson Williams was hanged. Samuel Francis was hanged. Their bodies were given over to doctors and medical students for dissection, a final degradation considered appropriate for those who had challenged the social order so fundamentally. Turner himself remained at large. For more than 2 months after the uprising ended, he evaded capture. He hid in the woods and swamps of Southampton County, living in a cave he dug beneath a fallen tree. He survived on what he could scavenge or steal at night from nearby farms. The white population was consumed with finding him. Rewards were offered. Search parties combed the countryside. Dogs were used to track his scent. During this time, the entire South reacted to news of the uprising. In every state where slavery existed, laws were tightened. Restrictions on the movement of enslaved persons were increased. Prohibitions against teaching them to read or write were enforced with renewed vigor. The few free black persons who lived in the South found their already precarious position further threatened. Some states passed laws requiring free black persons to leave or face being sold into slavery. The religious gatherings that had been tolerated among enslaved persons came under scrutiny. Turner had been a preacher, and white authorities concluded that black preachers posed a danger. New laws restricted religious assemblies and required white supervision of any gathering of enslaved persons. The passages of the Bible that spoke of liberation and deliverance were now seen as dangerous incitements to rebellion. The fear that gripped white Southerners was profound and lasting. The uprising had shattered the comfortable myth that enslaved persons accepted their condition. It had demonstrated that even in areas where slavery was said to be relatively mild, where masters considered themselves benevolent, violence could erupt with sudden and terrible force. White families who had lived surrounded by enslaved persons now regarded them with suspicion. Children who had been raised by enslaved women were warned to keep their distance. The whole structure of daily life shifted toward greater separation and greater control. On October 30th, 1831, Turner was discovered by a farmer named Benjamin Phipps, who found him hiding in the woods. Turner surrendered without resistance. He was taken to Jerusalem and placed in the county jail. News of his capture spread quickly. Crowds gathered outside the jail, some calling for immediate execution without trial. The authorities, aware that Turner's trial would attract enormous attention, proceeded with a degree of formality. Turner was appointed a lawyer, though the lawyer's role was largely ceremonial. The trial took place on November 5th, less than a week after his capture. Turner was charged with leading a slave insurrection that had resulted in the deaths of numerous white persons. The outcome was never in doubt. The purpose of the trial was not to determine guilt, but to create a record and to allow Turner to make a statement that might explain his motives. During his confinement, Turner was visited by a local lawyer named Thomas Ruffin Gray, who interviewed him at length. Gray's purpose was to create a document that could be published, a confession that would serve both as a historical record and as a warning to others. The resulting text, published as the Confessions of Nat Turner, contained Turner's account of his visions and his justifications for the uprising. How much of the text represents Turner's actual words and how much represents Gray's editing or embellishment cannot be determined. In the confession, Turner showed no remorse. He stated that he had acted according to what he believed was divine instruction. He described his visions in detail. He acknowledged that he had killed men, women, and children, but he framed these killings as acts of war against an unjust system. He expressed certainty that he had been right to act as he had done. The trial lasted one day. Turner was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on November 11th, 1831. He was taken to a clearing outside Jerusalem, where a gallows had been erected. A large crowd gathered to witness the execution. Turner was led to the platform. A hood was placed over his head. The trap was sprung, and he fell. His death was recorded as occurring quickly. After his death, Turner's body was given over to surgeons who dissected it. Various parts were taken as souvenirs. His skull was preserved. His skin was reportedly used to make items that were kept by white families as trophies. These acts represented a final attempt to degrade and dehumanize a man who had challenged the fundamental basis of Southern society. In the months and years following Turner's execution, the people who had been enslaved in Southampton County and throughout Virginia continued their lives under conditions of increased surveillance and restriction. The uprising had failed in its immediate objective. Turner was dead. His followers were dead or scattered. The system of slavery remained intact and had been reinforced by new laws and harsher enforcement. Yet something had changed in ways that could not be entirely suppressed. Among the enslaved population, Turner became a figure remembered in whispered conversations. His name was not spoken openly in the presence of white persons, but in the quarters at night. Stories were told about what he had done. These stories varied in their details. Some emphasized his visions and his belief that he acted under divine instruction. Others focused on the fear he had instilled in the white population. The fact that he had managed to elude capture for 2 months added to his legend. He had shown that resistance was possible, even if the ultimate outcome was death. The white authorities attempted to prevent Turner from becoming a martyr. They refused to allow his body to be buried in any manner that might create a site of remembrance. They published accounts that emphasized the brutality of the killings and the suffering of the white victims. They promoted the narrative that Turner had been a madman, a fanatic whose actions had no rational basis and certainly no justification. Yet they could not entirely control how he was remembered by those who had shared his condition. In other slave states, enslaved persons heard about the uprising through the networks of communication that existed despite all attempts to prevent them. Preachers on one plantation would learn details from a hired hand who had come from Virginia. A woman sold south would carry the story with her. These accounts were rarely accurate in their specifics, but they conveyed the essential fact: an enslaved man had organized others and had killed white people in large numbers before being captured and executed. The northern states, where slavery had been abolished or was being gradually phased out, received news of the uprising with mixed reactions. Abolitionists pointed to it as evidence of the inherent injustice and instability of slavery. They argued that as long as human beings were held in bondage, violence would periodically erupt. They published accounts of the uprising that emphasized the desperation that must have driven Turner to act as he had done. They called for immediate emancipation as the only way to prevent future bloodshed. Other Northerners reacted with horror at the violence itself. The killing of women and children, regardless of the circumstances that had led to it, struck many as inexcusable. Newspapers published detailed accounts of the victims, emphasizing their innocence and the brutality of their deaths. These accounts served to reinforce racial prejudices that existed in the North as well as the South. They contributed to the view that black persons were inherently violent and that slavery, whatever its moral problems, served the necessary function of controlling a dangerous population in the South. The response was uniform. Turner was denounced as a monster. Laws were passed to prevent any possibility of similar uprisings. The teaching of reading and writing to enslaved persons, which had been illegal but sometimes ignored, was now enforced with severity. Any white person found teaching an enslaved person faced fines and imprisonment. Enslaved persons found with books or written materials faced whipping or worse. The few schools that had existed to provide religious instruction to enslaved persons were closed. The restrictions extended to all aspects of life. Enslaved persons were prohibited from gathering in groups of more than a small number without white supervision. They were prohibited from traveling without written passes. They were prohibited from owning weapons of any kind, even tools that might serve as weapons. Free black persons faced increased pressure to leave southern states entirely. Some states passed laws declaring that free black persons entering the state could be arrested and sold into slavery. Yet resistance continued in forms less visible than Turner's uprising. Enslaved persons continued to escape via routes that would later become known as the Underground Railroad. They continued to practice forms of work slowdown and sabotage that reduced the productivity of plantations without being overt enough to warrant punishment. They continued to maintain their own cultural practices and religious beliefs despite attempts to suppress them. They preserved and passed on memories of those who had resisted, including Nat Turner. The white population attempted to return to the pattern of life that had existed before the uprising, but the attempt was never entirely successful. The trust that had allowed white families to live in close proximity to enslaved persons had been broken. New houses were built with security in mind. Locks were installed. Weapons were kept closer at hand. White Southerners spoke often of the loyalty of their enslaved workers, but their actions revealed an underlying fear that never entirely disappeared. The legal record of Turner's trial and execution was preserved in court documents that were filed away in county archives. Thomas Ruffin Gray's published confessions sold widely and went through multiple editions. These documents would be consulted by historians in later years, though their accuracy and completeness remained subjects of dispute. Turner's own voice, filtered through Gray's transcription and editing, remained the primary source for understanding his motives and his understanding of what he had done. In the decades that followed, other instances of slave resistance occurred, though none matched the scale or impact of Turner's uprising. In 1839, enslaved persons aboard the Spanish ship Amistad seized control and eventually won their freedom through legal action. In 1841, enslaved persons aboard the Creole took control of that vessel and sailed to the Bahamas, where they gained freedom. Individual acts of resistance and escape continued throughout the South. Each instance reinforced the reality that enslavement was maintained only through constant application of force, and that the enslaved never fully accepted their condition. The response of Virginia's government and the broader Southern establishment to Turner's uprising involved not merely suppression and punishment, but also a concerted effort to control the narrative of what had occurred. The institutions of the slave-holding South moved to minimize the implications of the revolt and to reassert the ideology that justified their system. The official reports produced by Virginia authorities emphasized several themes. First, they characterized Turner as an aberration, a madman whose actions had no basis in the actual treatment of enslaved persons in Southampton County. They pointed out that Joseph Travis, Turner's final owner, had been considered a fair and lenient master. They argued that Turner's visions and religious mania, not any rational grievance, had motivated the violence. This framing served to deflect any suggestion that slavery itself created the conditions for such uprisings. Second, the reports minimized the extent of support Turner had received from other enslaved persons. Official accounts stated that only a small number had actively participated, and that many enslaved persons had actually protected their masters or warned them of danger. These accounts, while containing some truth, ignored the more complex reality that many enslaved persons had been paralyzed by fear or uncertainty, and that others had refrained from helping their masters without actively joining Turner's force. Third, the reports emphasized the swift and decisive response of the white militia and the effectiveness of the legal proceedings that followed. The trials were presented as evidence that Virginia maintained proper order and justice even in the face of extraordinary circumstances. The fact that some enslaved persons had been acquitted was cited as proof that the trials had been fair and impartial, though the criteria used for determining guilt or innocence were never clearly explained. The Virginia legislature convened in the months following the uprising to consider what actions should be taken. Some delegates argued for gradual emancipation followed by colonization of freed black persons outside of the United States. These proposals received serious consideration but ultimately failed. The economic interests tied to slavery were too strong. The ideological commitment to white supremacy was too deeply entrenched. The debate concluded with the passage of new laws strengthening slavery rather than dismantling it. The new legislation made it illegal for enslaved persons to preach or conduct religious services. It tightened restrictions on the movements of enslaved persons and increased penalties for whites who violated laws regarding the teaching of reading and writing. It also increased funding for militia and patrol systems designed to prevent future uprisings. The message was clear. The system would be maintained through whatever level of control and surveillance proved necessary. Southern newspapers and journals published extensive commentary on the uprising. Much of this commentary focused on defending slavery against Northern criticism. Writers argued that slavery was a positive good, beneficial to both master and enslaved. They claimed that enslaved persons in the South were better off than free workers in the North, pointing to instances of poverty and labor unrest in northern cities. They argued that the institution of slavery was sanctioned by the Bible and by history, and that calls for abolition were misguided and dangerous. These defensive arguments increased in volume and intensity in the years following Turner's uprising. Southern intellectuals developed elaborate justifications for slavery based on supposed racial differences. They argued that black persons were naturally inferior and required the guidance and discipline that slavery provided. They claimed that emancipation would lead to racial violence on a massive scale. They pointed to Turner's uprising as evidence of what would happen if enslaved persons were freed. The churches of the South, with few exceptions, aligned themselves with these positions. Ministers preached sermons emphasizing the passages of Scripture that seemed to endorse slavery. They taught that enslaved persons had a Christian duty to obey their masters. They argued that slavery provided the opportunity for black persons to be exposed to Christianity, which they characterized as a great blessing that outweighed any temporal suffering. The few Southern clergymen who expressed doubts about slavery were pressured into silence or driven out. Educational institutions in the South incorporated these views into their curricula. Students at colleges and universities were taught that slavery was economically essential and morally defensible. Textbooks presented slavery as a benign institution that had existed throughout human history and served necessary social functions. Any critical examination of slavery was dismissed as Northern propaganda, designed to undermine Southern society. The federal government, dominated by compromises between North and South, largely deferred to Southern states on the management of slavery. Congress passed laws strengthening the ability of slave owners to recover escaped slaves from Northern states. The Supreme Court, in decisions like Prigg v. Pennsylvania in 1842, upheld the rights of slave owners over the objections of Northern states. The message was clear. Slavery enjoyed the protection of the national government. Within this institutional framework, any serious discussion of the injustice that had driven Turner to revolt became impossible in the South. The uprising was remembered as a criminal outrage, an instance of savagery that justified increased control over enslaved persons. The fact that Turner and his followers had killed women and children was emphasized repeatedly, used to foreclose any consideration of whether the system itself bore responsibility for creating the conditions that led to violence. Northern abolitionists attempted to keep the deeper questions alive. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave, spoke and wrote about Turner in terms that emphasized the impossible position of enslaved persons. Douglass argued that Turner had been driven to violence by a system that offered no peaceful path to freedom. William Lloyd Garrison published accounts of the uprising in The Liberator that challenged the Southern narrative. These Northern voices, however, had limited influence in the South, where abolitionist materials were banned, and anyone suspected of sympathizing with abolition faced ostracism or violence. The institutional denial extended to the physical evidence of the uprising. The graves of white victims were marked and maintained. Churches held commemorations on anniversaries of the killings. The suffering of white families was preserved in local memory and passed down through generations. The enslaved persons who had been killed in retaliation whose numbers exceeded the number of white victims, were given no memorials. Their names were largely forgotten. The places where they had been hung or shot were not marked. The historical record thus became unbalanced, preserving the memory of white suffering while erasing the memory of black suffering. That both preceded and followed the uprising. The passage of time did not erase what Nat Turner had done or what had been done. In response, the evidence of the uprising and its aftermath remained in court records, in newspaper accounts, in the memories of those who had witnessed events or heard testimony from witnesses. As years passed and then decades, the truth continued to surface in ways that complicated the official narrative. Thomas Ruffin Gray's published Confession of Nat Turner appeared in November of 1831 and circulated widely. The document presented Turner's account of his visions and his planning of the uprising. Gray had conducted the interviews while Turner awaited trial, and the resulting text was complex. It showed Turner as intelligent and articulate, describing his religious experiences in detail and explaining his belief that he had been chosen to lead his people out of bondage. The confession did not express remorse but instead maintained that the killings had been necessary. Gray's motives in publishing the confession were mixed. He sought to profit from public interest in the case. He also sought to demonstrate that Turner had been a religious fanatic whose actions should not be seen as representing any legitimate grievance. Yet the document worked against this purpose in certain respects. Readers could see in Turner's words a man who had thought carefully about his actions and who had acted from conviction rather than madness. The confession became a source that future historians would consult, though they would argue about how much of Turner's actual voice it preserved in the years immediately following the uprising. Witnesses began to speak more fully about what they had seen. Some white residents of Southampton County who had escaped the attacks provided detailed accounts of how the alarm had spread and how families had fled. These accounts revealed the extent of the panic that had gripped the white population and the randomness of who had survived and who had been killed. Geography and timing had determined survival more than any other factor. Enslaved persons who had witnessed events also spoke, though their testimony was not recorded with the same care. Those who had been questioned during the trials had given statements under duress, often with the threat of execution if they did not cooperate. Later, when the immediate danger had passed, some spoke more freely to trusted individuals. These accounts revealed details about the planning of the uprising, the debates among Turner's followers about whether to proceed, and the moment-by-moment decisions during the attacks. One significant fact that emerged was that Turner had initially planned to spare some white families. He had argued that those who had treated enslaved persons with relative kindness might be spared. His followers had rejected this position, arguing that any exception would create opportunities for alarm to be raised. The decision to kill without discrimination had been made collectively, not imposed by Turner alone. This detail complicated the narrative of Turner as a single madman and revealed the uprising as a more organized effort involving multiple actors. Another detail that emerged was the extent of the reprisal killings. Contemporary accounts had mentioned violence against enslaved persons following the suppression of the uprising, but the full scale became clearer over time. Estimates of the number of enslaved persons killed in retaliation ranged from 100 to 200 or more. Many had been killed without any evidence of participation in the revolt. The violence had been driven by fear and rage, with militia members and armed civilians killing enslaved persons they encountered and justifying it as necessary prevention of further rebellion. Accounts also emerged of enslaved persons who had protected white families during the uprising. Some had warned their owners of danger. Others had hidden white children or helped families escape. These accounts were used by defenders of slavery to argue that most enslaved persons were loyal, and that Turner's uprising represented only a tiny minority. What these accounts often overlooked was the impossible position of enslaved persons during the uprising, caught between fear of white retaliation if they joined or helped Turner and fear of Turner's forces if they actively opposed them. As decades passed and the Civil War approached, Turner's uprising was invoked by both sides in the national debate over slavery. Abolitionists pointed to it as evidence that slavery was unstable and morally indefensible. They argued that enslaved persons would always resist bondage and that violence would continue until slavery was abolished. Defenders of slavery pointed to the same events as proof that enslaved persons were dangerous and required strict control. They argued that any weakening of slavery would lead to more violence like Turner's revolt. During the Civil War itself, Turner's name was remembered by enslaved persons who fled to Union lines. Some of those who joined the United States colored troops knew the story of Turner and saw themselves as finishing what he had started. They understood that armed resistance to slavery had a history, that Turner was not the first and would not be the last to fight for freedom. This memory sustained them through the difficult years of the war. After the war ended and slavery was abolished, the story of Nat Turner was retold in different contexts. For formerly enslaved persons and their descendants, Turner became a symbol of resistance and courage. His willingness to risk everything for freedom was seen as heroic. The violence of the uprising was understood in the context of the violence of slavery itself, the daily brutality that had driven Turner to act. For white Southerners, Turner remained a figure of horror, a reminder of their fears about racial violence and black resistance. Historians began to examine the documentary record more carefully. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found the court records of the trials, the lists of those executed, the inventories of property confiscated. They found newspaper accounts from the period, both Southern papers that had condemned the uprising and Northern papers that had used it to argue against slavery. They found letters and diaries of white residents of Southampton County who had lived through the events. From these sources, a more complete picture began to emerge. What became clear was that Turner's uprising had been the largest slave revolt in United States history in terms of the number of white casualties. It had involved more active participants than other major conspiracies and revolts. It had produced a reaction that reverberated across the entire South and contributed to the hardening of positions that would eventually lead to civil war. The uprising had failed in its immediate objectives, but it had demonstrated that slavery was vulnerable to violent resistance, and that enslaved persons were willing to risk everything for freedom. The truth that surfaced over time was complex. Turner had been neither a simple madman nor a pure hero. He had been an enslaved man driven by religious conviction and desperation to commit acts of violence against a system he saw as evil. His followers had included men who acted from similar conviction and others who had been carried along by circumstances. The white victims had included both harsh masters and relatively lenient ones, adults and children, those who had actively supported slavery and those who had merely lived within its structure. The aftermath had included both legal proceedings that attempted to assign individual guilt and mob violence that killed indiscriminately. The execution of Nat Turner on November 11, 1831, did not close the story but marked a transition from event to legacy. The consequences of the uprising continued to unfold across years and decades, shaping the trajectory of slavery's final 30 years in the United States, and influencing how Americans would later remember this period of their history in Southampton County, life attempted to return to its prior pattern but never quite succeeded. The white families who had lost members to the uprising carried their grief and anger forward. Some left the county entirely, unable to live surrounded by the enslaved persons who remained. Others stayed but reorganized their households to minimize contact between white family members and enslaved workers. The trust that had allowed enslaved women to serve as nurses to white children largely disappeared. White families began to supervise more directly and to rely more heavily on overseers. The enslaved population of Southampton County lived under heightened surveillance. The patrols that monitored roads and enforced curfews operated with increased frequency and severity. Any gathering of enslaved persons attracted immediate attention. Religious services, even when permitted, were attended by armed white observers. The small freedoms that had existed before the uprising, the moments of relative autonomy, were eliminated. Every aspect of life was controlled and monitored. The economic impact of the uprising was significant. Property values declined in Southampton County as white families sought to sell and move elsewhere. The cost of enslaved persons increased due to fears of future violence and the executions that had reduced the local population. The county's productivity declined as disruption and fear affected agricultural operations. These economic consequences spread to neighboring counties and contributed to a broader reassessment of slavery's stability and profitability in areas with large enslaved populations. Across Virginia and throughout the South, the legislative response to Turner's uprising reshaped the institution of slavery. The new laws passed in the winter of 1831 and 1830 created what historians would later call the closing of Southern society. The relatively more open conditions of the early 19th century, when some enslaved persons had learned to read, and some free black persons had achieved modest prosperity, gave way to a rigid system of control that tolerated no deviation. The prohibition on teaching enslaved persons to read or write was enforced uniformly. White teachers who had provided religious instruction were prosecuted. Enslaved persons found with books faced severe punishment. The few schools that had existed for free black children were closed. This deliberate creation of illiteracy had consequences that extended beyond the end of slavery, as generations of people were denied education and the opportunities it provided. The restrictions on free black persons intensified. Some Southern states prohibited free black persons from entering. Others required those already present to register with authorities and to carry documentation at all times. Free black persons faced arbitrary arrest and the possibility of being sold into slavery. If they could not produce papers proving their status, many chose to leave the South entirely, moving to northern cities or to Canada where they faced discrimination but not enslavement. The religious life of enslaved persons was transformed. The independent black preachers who had operated with varying degrees of tolerance were forbidden to preach. Religious services for enslaved persons were conducted by white ministers who emphasized submission and obedience. The passionate worship style that had characterized black Christianity was suppressed in favor of more controlled services. Yet enslaved persons continued to practice their faith in secret, gathering in woods and swamps at night to hold their own services beyond white observation. The memory of Turner became contested immediately and remains so. For white Southerners, he was a murderer and a fanatic whose actions justified the harsh measures taken to control enslaved populations. For enslaved persons and later for their descendants, he was a freedom fighter who had struck a blow against an evil system. These conflicting interpretations would persist into the 20th century and beyond, shaping how Americans understood slavery and resistance In the decades after the uprising, other acts of slave resistance occurred, but none matched its scale. The memory of what had happened in Southampton County served both to inspire those who dreamed of freedom and to intimidate those who might have acted on those dreams. The certainty of brutal retaliation was clear, yet resistance continued in other forms: escape, work slowdowns, the preservation of African cultural practices, the maintenance of family bonds despite efforts to break them. The abolitionist movement in the North gained strength in the years following Turner's uprising. The violence of the revolt and the violence of the response both served to illustrate the fundamental incompatibility of slavery with American ideals of freedom and equality. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison, and others pointed to Turner's example when they argued that slavery could not be reformed, but must be abolished. They understood that Turner's willingness to fight had demonstrated that enslaved persons were not passive victims but active agents seeking their own liberation. The political tensions over slavery intensified. The compromises that had maintained the Union began to break down. Southern states became more defensive of slavery and more insistent that it be allowed to expand into new territories. Northern states moved toward abolition within their borders and resisted the expansion of slavery. The conflict that Turner's uprising had crystallized would eventually lead to the Civil War. When that war came in 1861, 30 years after Turner's execution, it brought the end of slavery, but at an enormous cost. 600,000 men died in 4 years of fighting. The South was devastated economically and physically. The enslaved persons were freed, but found themselves in a society that remained hostile to their equality and prosperity. The promise of freedom was only partially fulfilled, as the end of slavery gave way to sharecropping, segregation, and continued violence against Black Americans. The memory of Nat Turner survived through oral tradition among Black families and through the written record that white authorities had created. In the 20th century, his story was retold in various forms. Historians debated his motives and methods. Writers created fictional accounts that attempted to imagine his inner life. The basic facts remained. He had led the largest slave revolt in American history. He had killed or ordered the killing of 57 white persons. He had been captured and executed, and his actions had sent waves of fear through the entire slave-holding South. The question of how to evaluate Turner's actions remained difficult. The killing of children could not be justified by any standard. Yet it had occurred in the context of a system that routinely separated children from parents and subjected them to lifelong bondage. The violence of the uprising was terrible, yet it was dwarfed by the violence of slavery itself, the accumulated suffering of millions of people over generations. These moral complexities did not admit of easy resolution. What could be stated with certainty was that Turner had acted from a position of complete powerlessness within the legal structure. He had been property under the law, with no rights that white persons were bound to respect. He had been denied education, denied the ability to marry legally, denied the right to own property or to keep his own children. He had lived under the constant threat of sale, of whipping, of family separation. He had seen others treated similarly. The system offered no path to freedom except death or escape in choosing to fight. Turner had made himself a historical figure whose actions would be remembered and debated for generations. He had shown that the enslaved were capable of organized resistance, that they understood their oppression and were willing to risk everything to end it. He had terrified the white South and contributed to the conditions that made the Civil War possible. His legacy was violence and freedom intertwined, a reminder that systems of oppression do not end peacefully, and that those who suffer under them will eventually resist. The land where the events occurred remained. The farms where white families were killed returned to use under new owners. The places where enslaved persons were hanged or shot showed no markers. The county seat of Jerusalem, later renamed Courtland, kept its records of the trials. Descendants of both the white victims and the black participants lived in the area, carrying forward complicated family histories. The past did not disappear but persisted in memory and in the landscape itself. By the time a century had passed since Turner's uprising, the United States had fought a civil war, abolished slavery, endured Reconstruction and its violent overthrow, established Jim Crow segregation, and witnessed the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. Throughout this long and painful history, Turner's actions remained a reference point, a moment when enslaved persons had fought back with organized violence and had demonstrated that the system of slavery was vulnerable and ultimately unsustainable. The cost had been high, the outcome had been defeat, but the example persisted, a testament to the human desire for freedom and the lengths to which people will go to achieve it.